They called this shed madness. Then every child in Deerfield ate from it.
In February of 1889, the town of Deerfield, Oregon, learned what it meant to be forgotten. Not forgotten in the way a man forgets a name or misplaces a date. Forgotten the way a civilization forgets its edges, the way a system built on schedules and promises and printed timetables simply stops functioning at its furthest reach, leaving 260 people to understand slowly and then all at once that the world they had trusted to sustain them had turned its back and walked away. The silence that settled over Deerfield that winter was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of people conserving energy. The silence of mothers who had stopped asking their children what they wanted to eat because there was no longer any point in wanting. The silence of men who sat at tables where the bread used to be and stared at the wood grain rather than at each other because looking at each other meant acknowledging what they already knew. Smoke came from chimneys because wood was still plentiful, but the smell of cooking that had always drifted through the streets of Deerfield in the early morning had gone absent in a way that felt louder than any sound. But on the hillside east of town where the morning sun struck first and stayed longest, a woman named Sophronia Aldcroft opened the door to her drying shed before the rest of Deerfield had stirred, and she stood in the pale winter light and began to count. Her hand moved along the shelves the way a woman reads something she has memorized, fingertips brushing cloth sacks and sealed wooden boxes with the ease of long habit. Apples, pears, plums pressed into dense dark bricks that held the memory of August in every fold. Cherries dried to small, hard jewels that rattled softly when she lifted their container. Berry cakes wrapped in waxed cloth, each one the size of a man's palm, each one carrying enough nourishment to sustain a grown person through a full day of reduced labor. She counted without hurrying. She had always counted without hurrying. The number she arrived at, as she did every morning, was 512 pounds. Below her, the town of Deerfield sat in its hollow between the hills, like something that had given up on expecting rescue. The supply train that should have arrived on the 3rd of December had not arrived. The one scheduled for the 17th had not arrived. The emergency shipment that the territorial governor had promised in January existed only as words in a telegram because the Cascade passes were buried under 30 feet of snow, and the locomotives meant to clear them sat frozen on sidings 100 miles to the west, as useful as the promises of men who had never spent a winter at elevation. Sophronia closed the shed door, pressed her forehead briefly against the cold cedar, and allowed herself exactly one moment of something that was not quite prayer and not quite grief, and was perhaps simply the act of acknowledging the weight of what the next few weeks would require. Then she straightened her back, pulled her shawl tight against the February cold, and walked to the stable where her chestnut mare Buckwheat stood in the warm, dark chewing hay with the unhurried contentment of an animal whose owner had always planned ahead. She had not always lived on this hillside. She had not always been a woman who counted things in the dark before dawn. She had arrived in Deerfield in the autumn of 1885, carrying $200 of sorrow she had not yet finished learning the shape of, and a knowledge so thoroughly embedded in her hands and her memory that she barely recognized it as knowledge at all. It was simply what she knew, the way a man knows which way to hold a hammer. Her husband Silas had died that spring on the Willamette, killed by a falling Douglas fir during a logging operation that the company had been warned was moving too fast through stands that had not been properly assessed. The tree caught him across the chest. He lived long enough to tell her he loved her and to ask her to forgive the tree. She had done both. The forgiveness had taken considerably longer than the love, but she had managed it eventually in the way that stubborn and patient people manage difficult things by returning to it every day until it was done and then setting it down and not picking it up again. The logging company sent a foreman with an envelope, $200 in an expression suggesting he hoped to avoid a scene. She had given him the mercy of not providing one. She had taken the envelope, thanked him with the same courtesy she extended to everyone, regardless of what she thought of them, and begun making plans before he reached the bottom of the porch steps. Sophronia Aldcroft was the daughter of a fruit farmer in the Willamette Valley and the granddaughter of a woman from the Tennessee Hill Country who had understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had genuinely gone hungry as a child that the only provision you could truly depend upon was the one you made with your own hands during the seasons that allowed it or met. Her grandmother had carried that understanding from Tennessee like a valued tool, and her mother Maud had inherited it and refined it and passed it on the way. Valuable things get passed on not through formal instruction alone, but through years of shared labor, through the smell of fruit drying on warm wooden frames in the September air, through the particular satisfaction of a storage box weighed and found heavier than the one from the year before. Sophronia had absorbed it the way she absorbed everything essential completely, and without drama until it became indistinguishable from instinct. She had been 9 years old the first winter she truly understood what that knowledge was worth. Snow had come in November that year and stayed through March, and the world outside the farmhouse windows had turned white and then gray, and then the particular dead color of a season that has forgotten it ever intended to end. Her mother had opened a cedar box one morning and lifted out dried apple rings and pressed berry cakes and the small dense prunes that smelled of August, even in the hard middle of February. And she had set them on the table and said in the matter-of-fact voice she used when she meant for something to be remembered, that anything the summer gave you the winter could take back unless you knew how to hold on to it. Sophronia had been watching her mother's hands as she said it, and she had understood that the knowledge and the hands were the same thing. She had held on to it. For 35 years she had held on to it, and it had never yet let her down. When she looked at the map after Silas died, she was not looking for beauty or community or a fresh start in the sentimental sense that people meant when they used that phrase. She was looking at terrain. She was calculating sun exposure and elevation and the direction of prevailing winds in autumn. She was looking for the specific combination of morning light and reliable afternoon air movement that her mother had said were worth more than any piece of equipment money could buy. And she was looking for something else, something most people passing through a valley would drive past without registering. Deerfield had it. The hills around the town were loaded with wild fruit that nobody valued because nobody had taken the trouble to learn its value. Crabapple trees in every clearing, their small, hard fruit left to fall and freeze each year without anyone claiming it. Wild plum thickets along every creek bottom. Huckleberries so thick on the high meadows that in season the hillsides looked bruised from a distance. Blackberry brambles colonizing every fence line and abandoned foundation. And scattered through the valley floor, the remnant orchards of the earliest settlers' trees that had not been tended in 15 years, their branches crossing and tangling above the grass, their fruit dropping ungathered every autumn to rot where it fell. Deerfield was drowning in food that it did not know was food. Sophronia intended to know it. She paid $30 for 5 acres on the east-facing hillside above town land, so steep and rocky that the seller offered twice to lower the price, because he felt guilty taking her money for something so nearly worthless. She did not explain to him why she wanted it. She paid his asking price, shook his hand, and began. She built the drying shed first. Before the cabin, before the stable for buckwheat, before she had a proper roof over her own head, she built the structure that made everything else possible. It was long and narrow, 24 feet by 10, with slatted walls designed to allow air to circulate freely, regardless of wind direction, and a roof of cedar shakes that kept the rain off without sealing moisture inside. Inside, she installed wooden racks at 3 heights, each level, fitted with frames of cheesecloth stretched taut over pine borders. The frames slid in and out like the drawers of a wide cabinet, allowing her to load and inspect each level without disturbing the other 2. At the north end, she built a small stone hearth, modest and low intended not for warmth, but for the supplemental heat that wet autumn days required when the sun alone could not complete what it had begun. The principle was one her mother had stated once and never needed to repeat. Low heat and steady air movement were everything in the process of drying fruit. Too much heat cooked, rather than dried, breaking down the very compounds that gave preserved food its value and its keeping quality. Too little air movement allowed moisture to linger and mold to establish itself, no matter how carefully the temperature was managed. The work demanded attentiveness, a willingness to check the frames morning and evening, and adjust the pieces that were drying unevenly, and remove at once anything that had softened in the wrong direction. It could not be hurried. It could not be left to manage itself. It rewarded exactly the kind of person who understood that careful and thorough was always more efficient in the end than fast and approximate. Sophronia was precisely that kind of person, and she had been since she was old enough to hold a knife. The cabin came second. One main room, a sleeping loft above a fieldstone hearth large enough for cooking. A covered porch facing south where she could sit in the evenings with her ledger balanced on her knee. Buckwheat had a lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north wall, protected from wind, and adequately warm without requiring additional heat. The total cost of land shed cabin and stable, including nails and hardware, she bought from a supply merchant 2 towns over, rather than from Sheldon Jocelyn's Mercantile in Deerfield, came to $74. She had 126 remaining, and she was careful with it. Her first autumn harvest in 1885 produced 40 pounds of dried apple rings, the result of 14 days of work that began before sunrise and ended after dark, and left her hands so stained and roughened that she had to soak them each evening to restore any flexibility. She packed the rings in cloth sacks inside a sealed wooden box she had built and jointed herself, labeled the box with contents in date in her careful block lettering, and placed it on the lowest shelf of the drying shed. Then she took a sample down to Deerfield. Sheldon Jocelyn's Mercantile occupied the largest storefront on the main street and functioned as the commercial center of everything Deerfield needed and most of what it believed it wanted. Jocelyn had established this position over 15 years through a combination of consistent supply lines, carefully managed credit, and an instinctive understanding of the social mechanics of a small community. He knew who owed him and who depended on him and who feared him, and he understood with the accuracy of a man who has studied rooms his entire life that these three categories were never entirely distinct from one another. He was a lean man with a sharp jaw and a gray-streaked dark beard, and he had the eyes of someone accustomed to assessing the value of things quickly. When Sophronia set her sample on his counter, he picked up an apple ring with 2 fingers and turned it toward the window light, examining it with an unhurried thoroughness that managed to communicate through its very deliberateness that he was doing her a favor by looking at all. He bent it. He put it briefly to his nose. He set it down on the counter with the precise care of a man returning something to its place on a shelf where it did not actually belong. She explained that she was not asking him to carry her product or extend her any credit. She wanted only to set up a small table outside his store on market days to sell her own goods at no obligation or cost to him whatsoever. His eyes narrowed slightly. He told her that he already stocked everything Deerfield required, including dried fruit when the supply trains brought it in from Portland. That was proper dried fruit, he said, prepared by established companies in standardized quantities and proper packaging. What she was offering was, and here he gestured at the apple ring, with a small motion that managed to contain both dismissal and something faintly like pity, a homemade article from a hillside shed. People in his experience wanted what they recognized. They wanted labels and provenance. They did not want the product of a widow's spare time, however well-intentioned. "It is not a spare time article," Sophronia said, and her voice remained so level that no one observing them could have identified it as argument. "It is dried fruit prepared according to methods that have kept families through winters for 3 generations of my family. There is nothing spare time about it." The answer was still no. She was collecting her sample from the counter when she noticed something at the back of the store. A woman she did not yet know by name had taken a small step forward during their exchange, her hand lifting slightly toward the counter before something stopped it. The woman's eyes had gone to the apple ring with an expression that sat somewhere between recognition and longing. Then Jocelyn had shifted his weight, and the woman's hand had dropped, and the expression had been replaced with something carefully neutral. Sophronia saw every part of it. She gathered her sample, thanked Jocelyn with the same courtesy she would have shown anyone, and walked out into the autumn afternoon. She stood on the wooden sidewalk and let the understanding arrange itself clearly in her mind. She had believed she was contending with one man's opinion about her product. She understood now that she was contending with a man who had spent 15 years deciding what other people in this town were permitted to want. Those were very different problems, and the second one was not going to be solved by the quality of her apple rings. She walked back up the hill, and on the way she passed the cabin of Barnwell Tench. Tench was a man, somewhere past 70, who had worked the forests of the Pacific Northwest for the better part of 5 decades and had retired to a small cabin by the creek with the settled, uncomplaining manner of someone who had long since made peace with solitude and no longer found it worth remarking upon. He was sitting outside his door on a low wooden stool when Sophronia passed, working at a piece of fishing net, with the patient attention of a man for whom patience had ceased to require any effort. He looked at the basket she was carrying, and his expression did something that caught her attention because it was unexpected. It did not become amused. It did not become dismissive. It became briefly something that resembled genuine recognition, a surfacing of memory rather than opinion. He mentioned without particular emphasis that he had known people who used those in winter when he was young. Dried fruit. He said it with the flat neutrality of a man reporting a historical fact he found neither remarkable nor worthy of comment. Sophronia paused. She asked without loading the question whether he lived alone in the cabin. He said he had for a good long while and returned to his net. She left a handful of apple rings on the top rail of his fence as she passed. She did not stop to watch what he did with them. She walked up the hill in the slanted afternoon light, entered her shed, wrote the number 40 in her ledger, and began thinking about the spring. The mockery arrived before the first snow. Jocelyn started it as he started most things in Deerfield, in the easy offhand manner of a man who has a permanent audience and understands the social value of being the first to name something. He told his customers that the widow up on the hillside had taken to drying fruit by the hundreds of pounds, which in his view spoke to a woman somewhat unbalanced by grief. He was not unkind in his tone. He was worse than unkind. He was amused, which was more contagious. And the people who heard him laughed because Jocelyn's amusement had always functioned as permission to be amused, and permission was easier to take than the effort of forming a separate opinion. Prentice Foxmore gave the mockery its public name. He owned the sawmill at the edge of town and employed a substantial portion of the working men of Deerfield, which gave him a social authority that he wore with the comfort of a man who has never been required to question it. He told the men at the saloon one evening that the widow's operation had grown so large and so peculiar that it had stopped being a mere eccentricity and had crossed some border into genuine oddness, and he thought they might as well call it what it was. He called it the madhouse. He laughed at his own invention, the way men laugh when they are pleased with themselves, and the name took hold in Deerfield with the staying power of a label that contains some particular cruelty its author intended. His wife, Odessa Foxmore, gave the mockery its moral dimension. She organized a meeting at the church, which Sophronia was not invited to attend, and from that meeting emerged a settled consensus that Sophronia's open-air drying operation was unwholesome at minimum on the sound domestic grounds, that an unenclosed shed exposed to the outside air was inevitably accessible to birds and insects and whatever other contaminating presences occupied the hillside, and that no woman of genuine housewifely judgment would purchase food prepared in such conditions. Sophronia heard all of it. She had no shortage of neighbors willing to relay what was being said, and she had never discouraged them because she had always found that knowing what people actually thought was more useful than operating in comfortable ignorance of it. She listened to each account with the same attentive stillness she brought to most things. In the autumn of 1886, after Odessa Foxmore's meeting and its conclusions had completed their full circuit through the women's circles of Deerfield, Sophronia rose before light one morning, packed a small cloth bag with dried apple rings and pear slices, wrote the name Odessa Foxmore on a strip of muslin in her careful block letters, tied the muslin around the bag with a neat knot, and walked down the hill in the dark. She placed the bag on the lowest rail of the Foxmore fence, where it could not be overlooked by anyone entering or leaving the property, and walked back up the hill before the town had woken. Odessa Foxmore never acknowledged the bag to anyone. Sophronia heard through the ordinary information channels of a small community that the bag had been taken inside by mid-morning on the day it appeared. She filed that information in its proper place and returned to work. It was not an act of goodwill in the ordinary sense. It was something more considered than that. It was Sophronia saying in the only register she chose to use that she understood Odessa Foxmore was hungry in the most ordinary human way, that she wanted something good and sweet, and that the bag would be on the fence, regardless of whatever had been decided at the church meeting. Sophronia had no interest in requiring anyone to admit anything before she would help them. She had even less interest in performing virtue for an audience. She was simply unwilling to pretend that the bag was not there, or that the need was not real. Through 1886 and 1887, she expanded her operation with the systematic patience of someone constructing something that is meant to outlast any single season. She planted 4 apple saplings and 3 pear trees in the best drained sections of her hillside trees that would not bear for years, but that represented a deliberate investment in a future she was building rather than merely hoping for. She trained blackberry canes along her fence line on wooden trellises she built herself, angling them for maximum sun. She established an exchange arrangement with 2 families who lived farther up the valley, trading finished dried fruit for access to their wild huckleberry patches, which produced quantities neither family had ever found any use for. In the spring of 1887, a specific and useful piece of knowledge arrived through experiment rather than instruction. She had been drying a large batch of plums and had split them between two sections of the shed, one set at her usual temperature and one set at a slightly lower heat over a longer period. The difference in the finished product was unambiguous. The slower batch had a texture and depth of flavor that the faster one could not match. She noted this in her ledger with the same precision she applied to everything, and she adjusted all subsequent plum processing accordingly. That same summer, she spent 3 weeks refining her method for berry cakes, pressing dried huckleberries and blackberries together in a mold she had shaped from hardwood, wrapping the finished cakes in wax cloth, and testing their keeping quality at intervals across the following months. By October, she had a product she was confident would remain stable for 2 years under proper storage conditions. She noted this also in her ledger with the date and the test results, the way a person records something they intend to use later as evidence. By the end of the 1887 harvest, her stored reserves had reached 340 pounds. The harvest of 1886 ran from the first week of August through the middle of October, and Sophronia worked it alone with buckwheat and a long-handled picking basket and the methodical patience of a woman who had learned as a child that the difference between a good harvest and a poor one was almost never the land or the season, but the person's willingness to be thorough when thoroughness was inconvenient. She gathered wild plums from the creek bottoms in the heat of early August, filling the baskets twice a day and hauling them up the hill on the sledge in the long afternoon light while the valleys shimmered below. She picked huckleberries on the high meadows until her hands and the front of her apron were permanently stained the color of a bruise that would not resolve. She collected crab apples from every clearing she could reach on horseback, sorting them on the spot and leaving the wormy and the bruised and taking the sound ones, because her grandmother had taught her that the discipline of the harvest was as important as the harvest itself, that bringing home inferior fruit was a form of carelessness that compounded in the shed. She had learned from her mother that each variety had its own requirements and its own tolerances, and that treating them all the same was the error of someone who had never paid close attention. Apples wanted to be sliced thin, a quarter-inch was the reliable measure, and dip out briefly in salted water before they went on the frames to prevent the browning that made a product look worse than it was. Pears needed to be halved their cores, scooped clean, and brushed with a thin wash of diluted honey that enhanced their natural sweetness and gave the finished product a color that customers found appealing, though Sophronia herself considered aesthetics secondary to keeping quality. Plums she had learned to treat at lower heat than any other fruit in the shed, and the result justified the longer time it required. Cherries she dried, whole stems were removed at the lowest temperature the hearth would hold because they bruised easily and lost their color if pushed. And color in dried cherries was not vanity, but an indicator of the care that had gone into making them. She kept records of everything. Not only the weights and the dates, but the temperatures she estimated by feel and by the behavior of the fruit on the frames, the duration of each batch, the weather conditions during the drying, the comparative quality of the finished product. She was constructing in the pages of that ledger a body of knowledge that had no name in any book she had access to, but that was nonetheless systematic and rigorous and reproducible. The accumulated precision of a mind that had been paying attention since childhood. By the end of the 1886 harvest, the shed held 220 pounds. She stood in the doorway one October evening with the ledger open to the current page and read the number and felt something she recognized as satisfaction, though she would not have used that word aloud. She closed the ledger and went inside and cooked her supper and was in bed before 8 because the next morning there were still late-season blackberries on the south-facing slopes below the property line, and she intended to be there when the light was good. It was in the deep of that same winter, on a night when the wind came off the mountains with the sound of something that had been traveling a long way and was not finished yet, that Sophronia first found herself sitting at her table with her pen in her hand and the ledger open before her, and was unable to continue writing. She sat with the pen and looked at the numbers and felt a question arrive with a clarity that left no room for avoiding it. She was doing this for herself. That was plain. The quantity in her shed exceeded any conceivable personal need by a margin so wide it was nearly absurd. Silas was gone. She had no children. Buckwheat ate hay and oats. The numbers in her ledger described a surplus so far beyond ordinary prudence that from the outside it looked precisely as Jocelyn had described it, the accumulation of a woman untethered from the practical requirements of her actual life. But from the inside, it did not feel like that at all. From the inside, it felt like the most rational thing she had ever undertaken. The question was not whether it was rational. The question was whether she was building this reserve out of genuine conviction, or whether she was building it out of the stubbornness of a woman who had been publicly dismissed and could not stop until she had outlasted the dismissal. She sat with this question for a long hour time and did not arrive at a clean answer because the clean answer was not available. What she arrived at was something more honest, which was that she did not know with certainty who she was doing this for, and that not knowing did not constitute a reason to stop. She set the pen down, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed. In the days that followed that night, she noticed a change in herself that she did not entirely approve of, but was honest enough to acknowledge. She had begun to take more care with the shed than was strictly necessary. She oiled the frame hinges, though they did not need it. She re-examined the roof seams against the possibility of a leak that did not exist. She recognized with the clarity she usually reserved for other people's self-deceptions, doing what a person does when they have been unsettled by a question they cannot answer and need the reassurance of tasks they can complete correctly. She swept the shed floor twice in the same week. She relabeled several boxes that were already legibly labeled. She allowed herself this for 3 days. On the 4th day, she went up the hill to the huckleberry meadow above the property line and spent 8 hours picking. And by the time she came down in the fading light, she had 3 full baskets, and the question had moved to a place in her mind where it was still present, but no longer in the way of anything that needed to be done. The ledger that winter grew thick with entries. She had begun cross-referencing the batches, noting the weather conditions during drying alongside the weight of the finished product. In her assessment of the keeping quality, building a record that was not required by anything external, but that satisfied something in her that had always wanted the world to be more precisely accounted for than it usually was. By spring, the ledger was a document of considerable practical value, and she knew it, and she kept it in the cedar box, where she kept the things she did not want to lose. In the morning, she rose early and gathered the last of the late-season apples from the abandoned orchard below her property line, and by dark there were 380 pounds in the shed, and she had not returned to the question. By the autumn of 1888, the number had reached 512. Jocelyn observed this milestone at his store counter with the theatrical wonder of a showman presenting a curiosity. 500 pounds of dried fruit, he announced. The woman had lost her reason entirely. What possible purpose could 500 pounds of dried fruit serve for one person and one horse? He said she would be buried under prunes before she was buried in the churchyard. Prentice Foxmore, who happened to be present, laughed until he was forced to wipe his eyes, the way men laugh when they are genuinely pleased with someone else's ridicule of a third party. The same week that Jocelyn staged this performance, he placed a private order for 400 additional pounds of flour for the coming winter. He had heard concerning reports about the mountain weather, he explained to the man who filled his warehouse orders, and a prudent merchant did not let his reserves run thin on the strength of a printed train schedule. He said this with complete sincerity, apparently unable to perceive what he shared with the woman on the hill. Sophronia heard about both events from the same neighbor on the same afternoon. She added 20 pounds of dried pear to her stores, made the entry in her ledger, and said nothing to anyone. The autumn of 1888 arrived wet and stayed that way. Rain came early and persisted through October and November, saturating the mountain passes, softening the rail beds, converting the roads between Deerfield and the wider world into channels of mud that swallowed wagon wheels to their axles. The supply train that came through on the 15th of November was the last one that would come for 96 days. No one in Deerfield knew this when it departed. The railroad had announced nothing. The schedules posted at the depot showed trains arriving on their regular intervals throughout the winter, printed in Portland by men who drafted timetables from offices with windows that did not face the Cascades. The train pulled out of Deerfield. The weather closed the passes behind it, and on the east-facing hillside above the town, in a long, narrow shed that smelled of cedar and dried fruit and the accumulated patience of 3 complete harvest seasons. 512 pounds of carefully preserved food waited in cloth sacks in sealed wooden boxes while the winter that no schedule had accounted for settled itself over the valley below and prepared to stay as long as it liked. The first train that did not arrive was almost manageable. Winter delays were a known inconvenience in the Cascades, and Deerfield had absorbed them before, without lasting damage. Snow on the switches, ice on the rails, a locomotive requisitioned for emergency work elsewhere in the territory. Sheldon Jocelyn stood outside his mercantile on the morning the December 3rd train should have appeared and told the men who had gathered at the depot that delays in mountain country were nothing new and that it would be along before the week was out. His voice carried the particular authority of a man who has never been seriously wrong about a thing that mattered to people who were listening, and the men accepted it and went back to their work. The second missed train produced a different quality in the town. Not panic, something quieter and more persistent, the specific unease of people who have begun an arithmetic they would prefer not to finish. The conversations at Jocelyn's mercantile shifted in their character. Men who had been buying flour in 10-pound increments began buying it in 20s. Women who had been managing their household stores with ordinary seasonal care began opening their pantry doors and standing before them for longer than the task required. No one used the word shortage. Saying it where others could hear it was the kind of action that converted a possibility into a fact. The third train was the one that had been scheduled for the last day of December, carrying not only general supplies, but the special holiday provisions that families across Deerfield had ordered weeks in advance, the coffee and sugar and tinned goods that meant something beyond nutrition. When that train did not come, something in the town shifted that would not shift back. The arithmetic got completed silently in every household in the valley, and the answer was the same in every one of them. Sophronia had been watching the sky since November. She had also been watching the man at the train depot whose name was Jessup, a careful and ordinarily composed man whose face had been saying something different from his words for longer than anyone else seemed to notice. She had first registered it in mid-December on a morning she had come down from the hill to buy salt. Jocelyn was holding court on the sidewalk outside his store, explaining to a group of men that the situation was a temporary disruption, well within the range of ordinary mountain country winter difficulty, and that the railroad's operational capacity was equal to any weather the Cascades could produce. His voice was the voice of a man for whom the normality of the situation was not merely a reassurance, but a personal necessity, because his livelihood was built on the assumption of a supply chain that functioned. Sophronia stood at the outer edge of the group until the men began to drift away, and then she stepped forward. She asked Jocelyn without preliminary how much flour he currently had in stock. His face did something involuntary before he managed it. He told her he had sufficient reserves through February, provided the trains resumed their scheduled service in the new year, which he had every reason to expect. She held his eyes. She asked what his plan was if they did not resume on schedule in the new year. The color that moved into his face was not embarrassment at being questioned. It was the specific color of a man who has been asked in public the question he has been most carefully avoiding asking himself in private. He told her with a deliberateness that communicated both warning and dismissal that he would appreciate her not raising that kind of concern within earshot of other people. She was manufacturing anxiety where none was warranted. She was the type, he said, who looked for catastrophe in every inconvenience. Sophronia said nothing further. She purchased her salt and walked back up the hill. That evening, she opened her ledger to a clean page and wrote the number 512 at the top. Below it, she wrote 260, which was the count of living souls in Deerfield. She began calculating rations. Not comfortable rations, not the portions of a household running normally, but the minimum that could sustain a person through a day of light activity in cold weather. The kind of portion her grandmother would have called survival arithmetic. The number she arrived at was 47 days. She sat with that number in the lamp light for a considerable time. 47 days if she distributed everything she had. 47 days if she began tomorrow and gave nothing to her own consumption and nothing to buckwheat. She did not know how many days remained before the train came through. No one knew. The passes were sealed. The locomotives were idle. The territorial governor's promise of an emergency shipment had turned out to be a piece of paper with no machinery behind it. She closed the ledger. She did not sleep easily that night. It was not the prospect of acting that kept her awake. She had understood since early December what she would eventually do. What kept her awake was a number she had not calculated before and could not stop calculating now. 47 days. If the train came in 48, she would not be enough. If it came in 55, there would be a week of nothing at the end, and a week of nothing in February in the mountains was not an abstraction. In the days that followed, three separate people arrived at her door, each carrying a version of the same need, dressed in different clothing. A woman whose husband worked at Foxmore's mill came with the careful dignity of someone who had rehearsed and re-rehearsed exactly how to ask a thing without asking it plainly. A man from the far end of town arrived on her porch under the pretense of asking about the train situation, and then stood there a few seconds longer than the subject required. And Clem Dace, who was 12 years old and lived with his Uncle Doyle in a cabin at the lower edge of the creek, appeared at the corner of her property one afternoon and stood there without speaking, the way a person stands when they have been sent somewhere but have not been given the words to explain why. Clem did not meet her eyes when she came out to him. He looked at the drying shed with an expression she recognized from long acquaintance with people in difficult circumstances, the expression of someone trying very hard not to appear to be what they were. He said he was just passing. She went inside, came back with a cloth sack of dried apple rings, and placed it in his hands. He looked down at it and then up at her, and he did not say thank you. She did not require him to. The gratitude of a hungry boy does not need words, and words would have required him to acknowledge a situation that his uncle's pride had decided not to acknowledge. She told him he was welcome to come back as he needed. He nodded once and walked back down the slope, and she watched him go and thought about the uncle who had sent a 12-year-old boy up the hill rather than coming himself, and what that told her about the particular variety of pride that was capable of letting a child go hungry on its behalf. There was another visitor that same week who arrived by a different road and with a different kind of difficulty. Phoebe Fenlow was 26 years old, the wife of a mill worker who had not worked since Foxmore's mill went quiet in January, and the mother of an infant born in November in the worst possible season, and without complications, which Phoebe had taken as a sign that things were going to be manageable. She had been managing since the mill closed on what her husband's savings allowed, which had seemed adequate until the prices at Jocelyn's Mercantile made adequate a word that meant something entirely different from what it had meant before. She did not come up the hill to the shed. She had heard the mockery of the shed for 3 years along with everyone else, and while she had never joined in it, she had accepted it as background noise, the general opinion of the community she lived in, not endorsed specifically but not disputed either. What she did instead was go to Jocelyn's Mercantile with $4, which was the total of what she had, until her husband found other work and placed it on the counter and asked for a bag of flour. Jocelyn looked at the money. He looked at her. He told her the current price was $8 a bag. She stood at the counter without speaking for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have been allowed to last. Then she picked up her $4 and walked back out into the cold. She went home and put her infant in the cradle and sat down on the kitchen floor and thought for a long time about what her options were. The list was shorter than she had ever had occasion to discover it could be. She sat there through most of the afternoon while the fire burned down and the baby slept in its cradle, with the complete and uninstructed trust of infants who do not yet know that trust is something that can be misplaced. What moved her off the floor eventually was a memory. She remembered hearing early that winter a woman in the church say offhandedly that the widow on the East Hill had never once turned anyone away from her door. The woman had said it with a note of something that might have been admiration and might have been puzzlement, and Phoebe had filed it away without particular weight at the time. Now she took it out and looked at it and decided it was the most important piece of information available to her. She went the following morning before she had time to reconsider, with her infant bundled against her chest and her $4 still in her coat pocket, because she had not known what to expect and thought she might need them. She found Sophronia loading the sledge in the pre-dawn cold and said plainly and without ceremony that she had $4 and a baby and no flour. Sophronia looked at her and then at the infant. She put dried apple rings and berry cakes and dried pear into a cloth bag and handed it across and said that the $4 was hers to keep because what was in the bag was not for sale. Phoebe walked back down the hill in the early morning with the baby against her chest and the bag in her hand, and she did not cry until she was inside her own kitchen, with the door closed, and then she cried for a considerable time, not from shame and not entirely from relief, but from the specific feeling of discovering that a thing you had been quietly afraid did not exist does. The news about Barnwell Tench came on a Tuesday morning in February, and it came from Clem. The boy appeared at her door before 7 o'clock in the gray early light of that day, and she knew from the way he stood that he was carrying something heavier than himself. He told her in short, careful sentences that he had passed Tench's cabin the previous evening and seen the old man through the window, seated in his chair by the hearth, and had assumed he was sleeping. That this morning Tench was in the same chair and had not stood to make his morning tea the way he always did, and the fire in the hearth was out. Sophronia put on her coat and walked down to the creek with Clem following at her heels without being asked. She went into the cabin alone and told Clem to wait outside by the gate. The room was cold and absolutely still. Barnwell Tench was in his chair, his fishing net folded across his lap, his hands resting on it in the particular looseness of hands that are no longer holding anything or expecting to hold anything again. Beside the door, the woodpile was full and neatly stacked. On the table, a cup held a faint brown ring from tea brewed some days ago. The larder contained a tin that had been empty long enough to stop smelling like what it had held. He had not been cold. He had been alone and quiet, and too accustomed to asking nothing of anyone to begin asking now, when asking might have looked like weakness or need, or the admission that he had stopped managing. He had sat in his chair with the net in his hands, and the winter had simply outweighed him, the way winter outweighs everything that does not prepare for it. Sophronia stood in that cold room for a time that she did not measure. She was not praying exactly. She was doing what she did when something required her full attention before she could move past it, which was to look at it completely and let it settle into its proper weight in her understanding. Tench had been the only person in Deerfield who 3 years ago had looked at her basket of dried fruit without performing either contempt or indifference. He had said something simple and real about the thing he recognized, and he had gone back to his net. She had left fruit on his fence, and he had taken it, and neither of them had spoken of it again. And that had been an entire relationship, brief, inadequate, and now finished. She went back to the door. Clem was standing exactly where she had left him, his hands at his sides, his face very still. She looked at him and asked simply whether he had eaten anything that morning. He shook his head. She had begun carrying dried fruit in her coat pocket some weeks earlier, the way a person carries whatever they find they need most often. She put a portion of apple rings in his hand and told him to go home and eat them carefully, not all at once. She walked back up the hill in the February light, and by the time she reached her shed, she had made the decision that had been assembling itself in pieces for the past 6 weeks. She had always known she would make it. The question had been when, and the answer turned out to be now, today, this morning, after standing in that cold room beside a man who had died not of cold and not of age, but of the kind of silence that forms around a person who has been alone too long and has stopped expecting that anyone is paying attention. That night, she sat in the shed with a lamp and opened the ledger to the page where she had written 47. She did the calculation a second time, not because she expected a different answer, but because she wanted to hold the number clearly in her mind one final time before she stopped calculating and started moving. The number held. 47 days at minimum rations for 260 people. She did not know how many days remained before the train arrived. She thought about all of it, the months of careful work, the precise records, the 3 seasons of accumulation. And she recognized the fear she had been carrying for the past 2 weeks and named it correctly. Not fear of going hungry herself, not fear of the cold, but the fear that she had done everything correctly across 3 complete harvest years, and that the margin she had built might still not be sufficient, that she might empty the shed and the train might still be 10 days away. She sat with that fear and looked at all of it without flinching, and then she set it down beside the lamp and made a decision about it, which was that it was not a reason to withhold anything. She was going to begin tomorrow. She was going to give everything she had. The train would arrive when it arrived. She went inside, lay down in her clothes, and slept more soundly than she had in a month. Before first light, she loaded Buckwheat's sledge. 100 pounds from the shed, a careful selection across all types, apples and pears and plum, and berry cakes, the full range of 3 seasons. The mare stood in the pre-dawn dark with the steady patience of an animal that has made many early departures and does not regard the cold as a thing worth commenting on. Sophronia hitched the traces and led her out of the stable and down the frozen hill toward Deerfield. She set up her table on the wooden sidewalk directly in front of Sheldon Jocelyn's mercantile, in the exact space where he had told her 3 years and 4 months before that she would give the wrong impression. Clem Dace was already there. She had not told him to come. She had told no one. But he was standing at the edge of the sidewalk in the gray pre-dawn, with his wool cap pulled low and his hands in his pockets, watching her unload the sledge with the alert stillness of someone who understood that something was beginning and had decided to be present for it. She did not ask him how he had known to be there. She handed him a sack to carry, and they set up the table together without conversation. When it was ready, she looked at him and said that everything on it was free, that anyone who came could take what they needed without charge and without obligation. He looked at the table and then at her with an expression she would carry for a long time, after something between disbelief and a recognition so deep it had no ordinary name. Then he took a double handful of apple rings and ate them, standing there in the cold without any pretense, the way a hungry person eats when the cost of pretending not to be hungry has finally exceeded the cost of being seen. Within an hour, the word had moved through Deerfield in the way that significant news always moves through a small town faster than any deliberate telling. They came in a stream that did not stop. Mothers with children on their hips, mill workers who had been raised to handle things without assistance and were only now discovering the particular things you could not handle alone. Elderly people supported by younger arms moving through the cold with the careful economy of those who have learned to spend their strength wisely. Young women with the specific tiredness of people who have been feeding others from resources that were no longer sufficient. Sophronia distributed by household portioning carefully and explaining as she worked how to reconstitute the dried fruit and water, how to simmer it into a thick mixture that stretched further than eating it dry. She showed people the berry cakes and explained what they contained. She answered every question with the same directness she brought to every other task. Sheldon Jocelyn watched from inside his mercantile, standing at the front window, looking at the line that had formed at Sophronia's table and at the empty sidewalk in front of his own door. He remained there most of the morning. On the third day, he came outside. He approached the table when a small group was nearby, which Sophronia noted and understood. He spoke in the measured voice of a man who has decided what he is going to say and is going to say it as written. He explained that he wanted to offer his assistance with the distribution to ensure the process was orderly and equitable and conducted according to proper standards. He said that someone with experience in managing the flow of goods might be of considerable practical value. Sophronia continued portioning a sack of dried pear while he spoke. When he finished, she looked up at him. She asked whether he was proposing to take management of the distribution of provisions that she had grown, processed, stored, and transported entirely at her own expense, and was providing to the community at no cost or obligation whatsoever. Jocelyn said that was not quite his meaning. She asked him to be more precise about his meaning. He was not able to be more precise, and they both understood why, and the conversation ended there. He went back inside. Sophronia returned to her work. The following morning, a rumor moved through Deerfield. It traveled the way rumors travel in small towns, through the post office and the barber shop, and the gaps in doorway conversations, and it said that the fruit from the hillside shed had been dried in conditions of uncertain hygiene, that open-air preparation could not be trusted to meet any reasonable domestic standard, and that a woman working without oversight was not a reliable source of food for families with children. No one attached a name to the rumor. No one needed to. Sophronia heard it before noon. She did not address it publicly or trace it to its origin out loud. Instead, she went to find a woman named Mrs. Sperling, who was known in Deerfield as the most exacting housekeeper in the valley, and whose judgment on matters of domestic cleanliness was treated as final by everyone who knew her. Sophronia asked Mrs. Sperling to come to the shed that afternoon and examine the operation end to end and report what she found to whoever she saw fit. Mrs. Sperling came that same afternoon. She examined the frames, the labeled storage boxes, the swept stone floor, the cedar walls, the ledger records the separation between active drying and long-term storage. She was thorough and she was silent while she worked. She spent 40 minutes in the shed and came out with the expression of a woman who had arrived prepared to find fault and was leaving without having found any. That evening, she told her 4 closest neighbors what she had seen. By the following morning, the rumor had lost all its ground. It was in the 3rd week of distributions that Odessa Foxmore appeared at the table. She came alone at a mid-morning hour when the line was shorter. She wore the coat she kept for church and carried a cloth bag held in both hands, with a deliberateness that suggested she had thought about how to hold it before leaving her house. She did not look at Sophronia when she reached the front of the line. She simply held the bag open. Sophronia filled it with dried pear, the same variety she had left on the Foxmoor fence in the dark 3 years before. She said without emphasis or accusation that she remembered leaving that bag at the gate. Odessa Foxmoor raised her eyes. They were red at the edges, and what was in them was not shame, or not only shame. It was something that had been held back under considerable pressure for a long time and was now very close to the surface. She said that she had eaten the entire contents alone in her kitchen in a single afternoon and had not told a soul. Then she picked up her bag and walked away down the street. Sophronia watched her go and felt something she had not expected, which was not satisfaction and not triumph. It was something closer to a grief for the distance between two women who had lived 3 years in the same small town and had, through a combination of pride and stubbornness and the social arrangements of a man with a position to protect, never once had a simple, useful conversation with each other. Through the second week of February, Sophronia had begun to notice a change in who came to her table and how they came. In the early days of the distribution, people had arrived with the careful dignity of those who were accepting something they had not asked for and were not sure they deserved. They had been polite and brief and had avoided her eyes in the specific way that people avoid the eyes of someone who has seen them in a diminished condition. By the second week, something had shifted. They came more directly. They asked questions about the food, how to use it, how long it would last, whether their children could eat the berry cake safely. A man she had never spoken to before the winter asked her one morning while she was portioning his family's share whether she would be willing to show him what the shed looked like. She told him he was welcome to come up any morning. He appeared 2 days later with his wife and they spent an hour asking questions that were good questions, the questions of people who were beginning to think about the problem rather than merely experiencing it. She kept Clem informed of the arithmetic without burdening him with it. He was 12 and he had enough weight already in his life without carrying numbers that were not his to carry. But she let him see the ledger totals each morning when they loaded the sledge, and she explained her portioning decisions in plain language, and she answered his questions directly when he asked them. He asked surprisingly useful questions for someone his age, specific rather than general, the questions of a person who was paying close attention and wanted to understand the reasoning and not just the action. She noticed this and filed it as important information about him. There was a day in the middle of the third week when a man named Corbin, who had worked at Foxmoor's mill until the mill closed in January, came to the table and stood there for a long time looking at the fruit before he took anything. He was a large man who had spent 20 years as a physical laborer and had the particular difficulty such men have with acknowledging that they need assistance from anyone, let alone from a woman they had made a point of not speaking to for 4 years. Sophronia watched him standing there and did not speak or hurry him. Eventually, he picked up a portion of dried plum and looked at it and said very quietly, and to no one in particular, that he had not eaten since yesterday morning. She added a second portion to his share without comment and handed it across the table. He looked at it and then at her, and then he put it in his coat and walked away without saying anything further. She did not require him to say anything further. She had understood for some time that the most useful thing she could do for certain people was to make receiving possible without requiring them to perform gratitude in a way that would cost them more than they had available. By the fourth week, the sledge was making 3 trips down from the hill each day. Sophronia had added to the distributions whatever else she had available from her stores: dried venison she had traded with the Hill families, potatoes from her root cellar, eggs from 3 hens that had continued to lay in their snug coop through the entire winter. The children who had come to the table with the gray, drawn look of people running low were beginning to recover their color. The mill workers who had been barely making it through their days were maintaining their strength. Clem Dace had made himself an assistant without asking permission. He appeared each morning before the sledge left and helped load it, and appeared again at the distribution table to carry and sort and do the steady, useful work that let Sophronia keep her attention on portioning and instruction. She had not invited him to do this. She did not ask him to stop. One night near the end of the 4th week, after the 3rd distribution run, she went into the shed and stood there with the lamp without opening the ledger. She already knew the number: 130 pounds. 12 days at the current rate of giving, perhaps 14 if she stretched it, but she had already decided weeks ago that she would not reduce the portions, and she was not going to revisit that decision now. She stood in the shed and looked at the shelves that had been full in the autumn, that had held 512 pounds in their cloth sacks and cedar-sealed boxes, and she understood something she had not quite understood before or had not allowed herself to understand, which was that all her preparation, all her careful accumulation and methodical record-keeping and patient refusal to be discouraged had not been a guarantee. It had been a wager. She had staked her years of work against an uncertainty she could not measure, and she would not know until the uncertainty resolved itself whether she had been right about the odds. She had 12 days. She did not know how many days remained. She turned down the lamp and walked out into the February night. The sky was clear and very cold and full of stars that were not going to answer her question. She stood on the hillside for a time, looking down at the lights of Deerfield below the small orange glow of fires. In houses, the darkness of the mercantile with its empty shelves and its locked door. She had known those lights for 4 years now. She had watched them from this hillside through 4 winters. She went back inside and opened the ledger to a new page and wrote 130, and below it wrote 12, and she closed the book and lay down in the dark, and for the first time in the entire winter, allowed herself the honesty of not knowing how the story ended. The whistle reached Deerfield before the light did. It came across the valley in the gray hour before sunrise on the 9th of March. A sound so out of place after 96 days of its absence that the people who heard it first remained still for a long moment, listening for it again before they trusted it. Then it came a second time, and the sound traveled through the walls of Deerfield's houses the way certain sounds do not, through the ears alone, but through something older and more fundamental. People sat up in beds. Fires that had been banked for the night were stirred back to life. Boots were pulled on in the dark. Clem Dace heard it from the creek path, where he had been walking since before dawn in the manner he had developed over the past weeks of walking when the cabin felt too contracted and the quiet too heavy. He stopped on the frozen earth and turned his face toward the sound, and for a moment was entirely still. Then he ran. He ran up the main street of Deerfield at the top of his speed, a 12-year-old boy's voice breaking open in the cold morning air, with something that was not quite a word, but needed to be, and that sound moved through the town ahead of the whistle's third call and brought people to their windows and doors before they had consciously decided to move. Within minutes, the street was filling. People came out in coats pulled over nightclothes, boots unlaced, or absent children scooped up and carried old people supported and guided, moving toward the depot with the momentum of a community that had been holding its collective breath for 3 months and had just been told it could stop. There was no orderly procession. There was the sound of people moving fast towards something they needed to see with their own eyes before they would believe it. On the hillside east of town, Sophronia heard the whistle from her porch. She had been sitting in there for over an hour, already in the dark before the dawn, with a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hands, while she watched the sky lighten by degrees over the eastern ridge. She had not been waiting for the train specifically. She had passed the point several weeks earlier of waiting for any specific thing and had moved into a broader and more sustainable condition, a readiness for whatever the day brought that did not depend on predicting what the day would bring. When the whistle sounded, she set the cup down on the porch railing and went directly to the drying shed. She stood in the doorway in the growing light and looked at the shelves. 48 pounds. She had counted the previous evening, and the number had not changed in the night, as numbers set down in a ledger do not change between the writing and the reading. 48 pounds. At the current distribution rate, 4 days. The train had come through with 4 days remaining. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the cedar frame for a time that she did not count. Then she pressed her forehead against the wood, the way she sometimes pressed it against Buckwheat's warm neck, when she needed a moment with something solid and patient and without demands. She stood that way until the moment was complete. Then she straightened and went to the stable and began her morning. She did not go down to the depot to watch the train unload. The town was celebrating and she was glad for it, but there was still work. 48 pounds on the shelves and families who would come to her table this morning, not because they had heard a whistle, but because they had come every morning for 5 weeks, and the habit of receiving was not going to dissolve instantly just because the train had arrived. She loaded the sledge with the same care she had brought to every loading since the first day. Clem appeared at the gate as she was hitching Buckwheat's traces, arriving without announcement, as he had every morning for a month, and he went to the back of the sledge and took his place there without being asked. They went down the hill together in the sharp cold of the early morning. On the main street, Deerfield was still in motion with the energy of people processing very good news. Men stood in groups outside the depot watching the unloading. Someone had started a fire in a barrel near the mercantile. Children moved through the adults with the uninhibited freedom of children who had been kept indoors too long and were reclaiming the street. The particular tension that Sophronia had watched settle over the town through December and January and February was still present, but loosening the way cold iron loosens when warmth finally reaches it. She set up her table in the usual place and distributed the last of her stores in the usual way to the families who came, because coming had become their morning portioning, carefully until the final cloth sack was empty. When she folded the last sack and set it on the board and looked at the empty table, she allowed herself a single moment of something that was neither pride nor relief, but was composed of both and of something else as well, something that did not have a common name, the particular quiet of a person who has carried a heavy thing a long distance and has set it down in the right place. Clem stood beside her and said nothing. She had come to appreciate this quality in him, his ability to be present without requiring the presence to be verbal. It was not a common quality in people of any age. She told him to return the table boards to the hardware merchant from whom she had borrowed them. He picked them up without ceremony and carried them away. The gathering at the church was set for the following Sunday, which gave the town a week between the arrival of the train and the arrival of reckoning. Sophronia thought this was correctly calibrated. Not so soon that the rawness of the recent weeks would distort every word spoken, and not so long that the comfortable relief of full shelves could soften what needed to be said clearly. She attended, as she always attended services, taking her place in the last row on the left side of the church, where she had sat since her first winter in Deerfield, close enough to hear clearly and far enough from the front to observe the room without being observed doing it. The church was full beyond its usual attendance. The congregation had dressed with care, which Sophronia read as evidence that people understood the occasion was not ordinary. There was a quality in the room before any word was spoken, a collective and somewhat uncomfortable attentiveness. The quality of a room full of people who know something true is about to be said and are not certain how they will receive it. Sheldon Jocelyn rose before anyone else stood or any process was established. He walked from the third pew to the front of the church with a deliberateness that was different from his usual merchant's confidence, slower, and more weighted the walk of a man carrying something that has been pressing on him for weeks and who has decided that today is the day it comes off, regardless of the cost to his dignity. He turned and faced the congregation and was silent for a long moment. The church was perfectly still. He began in the autumn of 1885. He described the morning Sophronia had come into his store with a sample of dried apple rings and asked only for the use of a table outside his door on market days. He described the apple ring he had held to the window light and examined and returned to the counter with the deliberateness of a man handling something beneath his standards. He described the words he had used. He described these things without qualification or softening, in the flat, plain way of a man who has decided that the only honest account is a complete one. His voice remained steady. His hands resting on the edge of the lectern did not. He said that his establishment had stood empty for 3 months, that his shelves had held nothing of use, that the woman he had turned away from his door with contempt had come back to that same door and set up a table in front of it and fed every family in the valley from stores she had built, while the town was laughing at the enterprise of building them. He said that his authority over Deerfield's sustenance, which he had considered as solid as the building it operated from, had turned out to be entirely dependent on a supply chain he had no control over and had never thought to question. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked up. He said that the week before he had gone to Sophronia Aldcroft's shed with a contract proposing to purchase dried fruit from her and from her students and at fair prices for resale in his store under the names of the people who had made it. He said she had read the contract, told him she would consider it, and asked him to wait 3 days for her answer. He paused, and something in his face changed in a way that was more honest than shame, something that had gone past shame and arrived at something quieter and more permanent. He said those 3 days were the most fairly earned weight of his professional life. He turned and looked directly at Sophronia in the back of the room. He said that he did not expect her forgiveness and was not asking for it. He said that she had sustained his family when he had given her abundant reason to feel no obligation to do so, and that he had spent 3 months understanding the difference between a man who produces something of genuine value and a man who has arranged himself at the point where other people's value passes through on its way to the people who need it. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, and then Prentice Foxmore stood. He was a large man who normally occupied space with the ease of someone accustomed to being taken at his own estimate, and the way he stood now was not that man. He stood with his shoulders drawn slightly in and his large hands held together in front of him, and he looked at the floor for long enough that the room began to wonder whether he had the words. He did not look at Sophronia when he began. He looked at his wife. He said that when the distributions were happening, he had sent Odessa to the table rather than going himself because he had not been able to make himself stand in front of the woman he had publicly ridiculed and receive food from her hands. He said this plainly without the softening qualifications that people usually reach for when they are admitting to something they are not proud of. He called it cowardice with the precise intonation of a man who has settled the argument with himself about what to call it and is no longer interested in other candidates. He said that he had named her shed the madhouse in the saloon and that his audience had laughed. He said that he had called her work a sad little project born of a sad little life, and that he understood now that in saying so, he had been accurately describing something in himself that he had not yet had occasion to examine. He sat down. Odessa Foxmore stood immediately after him as if the movement had been practiced, though perhaps it had not been. She spoke more quietly than her husband. She did not offer examination or argument. She said only that she had eaten Sophronia Aldcroft's dried pear in the 4th week of the famine and had wept because it had the taste of summer, and she had forgotten across those weeks of cold and want what summer tasted like. She said she had not been crying about fruit. She sat down. Others spoke. The mother of 3 young children who said simply that the berry cakes had been the difference between her children having enough and not having enough. A mill worker who said he had been too proud to come to the table himself for the first 2 weeks, and that his wife had made the trip without telling him, and he had been living on the result without knowing where it came from, and that when he found out he had sat down in his kitchen and had not been able to think of a single thing to say that was adequate. An elderly woman who said she had been brought her portions by a neighbor she had never spoken to before December, and that she intended to correct that before winter came again. Phoebe Fenlow stood near the end, and the attention her standing drew was different from the others because she was young and not known for public speech, and carried no obvious reason to confess. She said she had not mocked Sophronia Aldcroft and had nothing to confess on that count. She said she was standing because she wanted certain things said where witnesses could hear them. She described the morning she had gone to Jocelyn's Mercantile with $4 in her coat, which was all the money in her house, and had been told the current price was $8 a bag. She described walking home and sitting down on the floor of her kitchen with her infant in the next room and trying to think clearly about what her options were, and that the list of options was shorter than she had ever wanted to discover it could be. She said that what had kept her from the far end of that list was remembering after a long time sitting on that floor that there was a woman on the hill east of town who had never turned anyone away, who had spent 3 years being laughed at precisely because she had built a thing that turned out to be the only thing that held. She said she did not think that was an accident. She said she thought that was the entire point, if anyone was interested in the point. She sat down. The room settled into a different kind of quiet than it had held at the beginning, a quiet with more weight and more room in it. Sophronia did not stand immediately. She let the quiet exist for a time. Then she rose from the last row and turned to face the congregation, rather than walking to the front, because she was not going to stand above the people she was addressing. She said that her mother had taught her to dry fruit, that her mother had learned from her grandmother, who had brought the knowledge from the Tennessee Hill Country as deliberately as she had brought anything else she valued from there. It was not cleverness on her part, and it was not foresight in any prophetic sense. It was the inheritance of women who had understood from genuine experience of its absence that abundance does not maintain itself, and that the only rational response to having enough is to ensure as thoroughly as possible that having enough persists. She looked around the room without hurrying. She said that she had not accumulated 500 pounds of dried fruit to demonstrate a point to anyone. She had accumulated it because waste was something she found genuinely offensive, because every autumn, the hillsides above Deerfield shed more food than the valley could eat in a season, and because she had grown up understanding that food left to rot on the ground was not a neutral event but a failure of attention and will. Her voice changed when she came to Barnwell Tench. It did not become louder. It became quieter, and the room adjusted accordingly. She said that Barnwell Tench had not died of cold. He had died of the kind of silence that forms around a person who has been alone for long enough to stop expecting that anyone is paying attention to whether they are present or absent. She said that Clem Dace, who was 12 years old and who had his own reasons for understanding what it meant to occupy that kind of silence, had walked past Tench's cabin every day and had been the one to notice when the old man did not rise to make his morning tea. She said she believed that deserved to be stated in front of the town so that Clem Dace understood that what he had done was not a small thing. Clem was seated in the third row from the back with his Uncle Doyle. He did not look up when she said his name, but the set of his shoulders changed in a way she could read from where she stood. She said that if anyone wished to learn what she knew, she would teach them. The knowledge required no equipment that a person could not build from available materials. The sun that did the work cost no one anything. The fruit on the hillsides above Deerfield belonged to whoever was willing to go up and gather it. No family in the valley needed to stake their survival entirely on a supply chain they had no hand in and no control over, provided they were willing to do the work that preparation required. She said she was not angry with anyone in the room. She had never been angry. She had been occupied. She sat down. The week that followed the church meeting had a quality that would take Deerfield years to name accurately. It was not the simple relief of a crisis that had passed. It was the more demanding experience of a community that had been shown something true about itself and had to decide what to do with the knowledge. Jocelyn came to the shed on Thursday carrying the contract he had described at the church. Sophronia read it carefully twice. She told him she would accept it with one addition, which was that a portion of his store's space be dedicated not only to selling preserved goods, but to informing customers in plain readable language how those goods were made and where they came from, and how any household could begin producing its own. She said her intention in agreeing to this arrangement was not to build a market for herself. Her intention was to make herself unnecessary. Jocelyn looked at her for a long moment. He took his pen from his pocket and added the condition to the contract in his own handwriting and signed it on the counter of her shed, which was the first time he had ever been inside it. The summer of 1889 brought 11 new drying sheds to the hillsides above Deerfield. Sophronia taught every person who came to her, and more came than she had anticipated, and from more varied directions than she had expected. Women she had never exchanged more than a nod with. Men who had initially sent their wives and then appeared themselves after a week too curious or too proud to stay away indefinitely. Prentice Foxmore arrived on a Saturday morning and worked for 4 hours on frame construction and built it correctly on the second attempt and asked 3 questions that were all good questions, which Sophronia noted, because good questions from someone learning something new are a reliable indicator of a person who will eventually not need to ask questions at all. There were things that surprised her about who came and who did not. Several of the women she had expected to see first were among the last to appear, held back by some private calculus of pride or embarrassment that she did not attempt to analyze. And several people she had expected nothing from arrived early and stayed long and worked with an application that she found genuinely impressive. A young man who had worked at the mill and had no particular reputation for any domestic skill turned out to have an instinctive understanding of airflow that allowed him to design a drying shed configuration she had not considered and that she incorporated into her own thinking. A woman in her 60s who had spent 40 years relying entirely on the supply trains for her household provisions proved to be a faster learner than most people half her age, grasping the principles behind each step rather than simply memorizing the steps themselves, which meant she could adapt when circumstances varied rather than being helpless when something was not exactly as it had been demonstrated. Sophronia taught without ceremony the way she did everything that mattered. She showed rather than explained where showing was possible. She answered questions without embellishment. She made no distinction between the people who had mocked her and the people who had not, because the point was not to provide a lesson in social consequence, but to ensure that the knowledge moved from her to as many people as possible before the next winter arrived. She had been carrying this knowledge alone for 4 years. The carrying was over. What remained was the transfer, and she intended to complete it as thoroughly as she had completed everything else. Clem Dace built his shed without asking for help or instruction. He built it at the side of his Uncle Doyle's cabin, 8 feet by 6, using lumber from a collapsed outbuilding that Doyle had released to him for the purpose. It was small and the south wall ran slightly out of true, and the slat spacing was not perfectly uniform. But the essential logic was correct: the orientation to the morning sun and the provision for air movement in the separation of the small hearth from the main drying space. When Sophronia came to inspect it in late June, she stood in the doorway and studied the construction for a long time without speaking. She told him the north wall slats were set too far apart and would allow the night winds off the ridge to carry too much heat out of the shed in September and October. He asked by how much. She showed him with her hands. He went for his tools and spent the afternoon correcting it. She came back the following morning, examined the wall, and said nothing further. He had learned by then that her silence on a matter of craftsmanship was not indifference but approval, and he received it as such. She watched him that summer with the specific attention she gave to things she wanted to understand fully. He was not the kind of learner who absorbs instruction quickly and exceeds it effortlessly. He was something more reliable, a person who made a mistake once and did not make it again, who asked questions that were always precise rather than general, who grasped instinctively that useful knowledge is not something that can be received and stored, but something that has to be built up through doing, through the accumulation of specific small experiences until they add up to competence. Odessa Foxmore came to the shed for instruction every day of the first 2 weeks, and by the third week she was arriving before Sophronia and had the morning frames prepared before the day's work began. By the end of August, she had produced a batch of dried pear that Sophronia, who did not distribute praise as a matter of social courtesy, said was equal to her own. On an afternoon in late September, the valley below them turning the colors. It turned each year at this time of season, the air carrying the particular clarity that preceded the first frost, by exactly the number of days that her mother had taught her to watch. For the two women sat on Sophronia's porch, with their knives and their boards slicing fruit for the afternoon frames. They did not speak of the winter. They did not speak of the church meeting or of the bag left on a fence before dawn in 1886. They talked about the pear harvest, which had exceeded what either of them had projected, and about a method for pressing berry cakes that Odessa had arrived at independently, and which Sophronia considered a genuine improvement over her own approach. It was, Sophronia thought, the most ordinary afternoon she had spent in another person's company since Silas died. She did not say this. She sat with it quietly and found that it had more weight than she had expected, and a warmth she had not known she was missing until it was present. The phrase came into common use in Deerfield that year, and stayed in use in the years that followed, the way phrases stay when they have been earned by something real. Filling the shed, it meant preparing during the seasons of sufficiency for the seasons that were not sufficient. It meant not placing your entire trust in systems you did not build and could not repair. It meant doing the slow and unglamorous work when conditions permitted it, so that when conditions did not permit it, there was something to draw from. It was spoken without explanation by people who had learned its meaning in the specific and irreplaceable way that experience teaches things. Sophronia lived on her hillside for 27 more years. She watched the town grow beneath her and the railroad become more reliable, and the years pass in the rhythm that a life acquires when it is lived attentively in one place. She taught dozens of people the knowledge her grandmother had carried from Tennessee, and she watched that knowledge spread through the valley in the way practical knowledge spreads when it is allowed to, through demonstration and patient repetition and the slow accumulation of results that speak more persuasively than any argument. In the winter of 1904, a bridge failure on the Eastern Line interrupted supply for 3 weeks. It caused inconvenience and some short-term hardship in the way that unexpected disruptions always do. It did not cause hunger. Every family in Deerfield had a shed. Buckwheat died in the autumn of 1906 at an age that the veterinarian said he had rarely seen in a working horse, and Sophronia buried her near the drying shed, which was the right place because the mare had carried every load that went down from that shed in the hardest winter the valley had known, and had done it without complaint, with the steady and uncelebrated competence of an animal that understands its work and requires nothing beyond the work itself. Sophronia died in the spring of 1916 at 75 in the cabin she had built, with the last of Silas's compensation money on a hillside that no one had wanted. She was buried beside Silas in the cemetery at the edge of town, in a grave that looked out across the valley she had spent 30 years learning. Clem Dace was 39 that year. He had become a carpenter working in the valley where he had grown up with a family of his own and a drying shed behind his house that he maintained with the same care he gave to any structure he expected to outlast him. He came to the funeral and stood at the grave with his hat in his hands through the whole of it, and afterward he spoke to old Doyle, who was still living and had not mellowed much, but was slower now in the way that age enforces, and asked whether anyone had considered what to put on the door of the shed. Nobody had thought of it. Owen took 3 days with the question. On the fourth day, he came to the shed with his tools and a piece of cedar he had brought from his shop, a piece he had selected with the care a craftsman applies to wood that is meant to stand for a long time in variable weather. He worked without hurrying. The letters he cut were not perfectly uniform because he was a carpenter and not a sign maker, and he did not pretend to a precision the work did not require. But they were deep cut and clear cut to survive seasons of rain and frost and the drying summers in between. When he stepped back and read what he had made, he stood there for a time in the September light with the smell of fresh cedar shaving around him. He had been thinking across those 3 days about a morning in February 1889 when he had been 12 years old and had not eaten anything since the previous afternoon, and a woman he barely knew had put fruit in his hands without requiring him to explain or justify or ask. He thought about the morning she had stood up in the back of a crowded church and said his name out loud in a voice that was not performing kindness, but was simply reporting a fact, and told the room that what he had done was not nothing. He thought about all the mornings of that winter he had walked down to her table and all the loads he had helped lift onto the sledge and everything he had learned from watching her work, learned not because she had taught it in the manner of teaching, but because she had done it in front of him and trusted him to see what he was looking at. He had been carrying the phrase for 27 years. He had not heard her say it publicly. He had heard it on a February morning when he was 12 and very hungry from a woman standing behind a plank table in the cold, talking to no one in particular, while she portioned out the contents of her shed, saying it the way a person says something they have carried inside them long enough that it comes out without deciding to. He had taken it and held it because it was the truest thing he had heard that year, and because some true things need to be held until the place for them is clear. Now the place was clear. Summer forgets. The shed remembers. The shed still stands. The cedar shakes on the roof have been replaced 3 times in the years since Sophronia built it, and the interior frames have been rebuilt twice to account for changes in what is being dried and by whom. But the structure itself is hers, the dimensions she chose, and the placement she selected in the autumn of 1885 when she was a widow of 44, with $200 and a hillside no one wanted, and a knowledge so deeply held she barely recognized it as knowledge at all. Each autumn when the fruit ripens on the hillsides above Deerfield, people come to that shed to do the work that she began, and the smell of drying fruit on cedar frames in the September air is the smell of a knowledge that was not lost because one person understood before anyone was asking her to that summer's abundance was not a permanent condition, but a temporary and generous loan, and that the only honest response to a loan was to make the most of it while it was available. Above the door, the letters that Clem cut in the September of 1916 are still legible, still deep, still answering a question before it is asked. Summer forgets. The shed remembers.